All right, happy Halloween. This is October 31st, at least in North America. And we've got a few things on the agenda for the Gateway API meeting, actually way more than I think we'll get to, but thank you everyone for making it. Again, this is just a normal Kubernetes community meeting. We're subject to the same code of conduct as any other Kubernetes community meeting. So again, just please be nice to each other. This agenda that I have screen shared here should be editable by anyone. If you're looking for a link, I can post it in chat. But the high level thing is, if you see something like on here that, or don't see something like on here that you'd like to talk about, please add it to the agenda. Today, I feel like our agenda is going to be packed, so we may not get to everything, but we'll see. I'm terrible at predicting these things. So yeah, first off, I want to say thank you to everyone that was able to make it to KubeCon. It was great to see many people, but also apologies to anyone who couldn't make it for any kind of reason. I wish we could have included you better. I know for working sessions, especially, I wish we had better, technology in the room that would have made a hybrid meeting more practical. We tried to include a bunch of notes from our meetings down below.
I haven't looked yet, but I certainly appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And yes, everyone that couldn't be there was definitely very missed. These meetings largely were just like extensions of our virtual Gamma and Ingress focused meetings. So, nothing too groundbreaking there, but maybe I'll just highlight a couple things. One, there was some interest. So in one of the Contrib Summit talks, I presented, some of the pain points we've run into with gateway CRDs. And there's been some interest as a result of that in getting a new working group spun up to try and address some of these things, so that we can have kind of cross-SIG effort to ensure that the pain points we're experiencing are smoothed over by the time the next projects behind us run into them. So really excited about that. If that's the kind of thing that is interesting to you, definitely reach out, but it seems like something will happen there. Talking to people from SIG Auth and security bit, there's some interest or recommendation for us going through a third-party security audit. This is something like that K/K goes through on occasion. And I think we've been missed because of where we are, but it would make sense for us to go through the same process. So we need to get the wheels going on that process. And again, that's reaching out to SIG Auth, SIG Security, I think SIG Arch, a few different SIGs, but again, just another follow-up out of here. It seemed like there was sufficient interest. I talked to people in SIG Auth and SIG Storage about reference grant again, and just moving that not just to a neutral home, but directly to K/K. Can hope. And then this was one of the things specifically out of our working session, that gRPC route, every implementer I talked to said, oh, that's, that is something we definitely want to support, but it's not on our, 6-month roadmap. Basically, it is not something like that is coming tomorrow. And because our graduation criteria is the way it is, we really need some implementations before we can get to standard channel, before we can get to beta, etc. I'm seeing a comment here from Sunjay that Contour is looking at prioritizing this soon. I don't know. Is anyone else aware of implementations that are coming down the pipeline that might be ready in the next 6 months, let's say?
I think Envoy Gateway might support the API in the next release, so that in the next 6 months.
Okay, great.
Traffic Director as well.
Great. Okay.
Depending on how we go with everything else, maybe Zillium.
Okay.
Isn't it translatable to an HTTP route?
For the most part, yes. If you pair it with some conformance tests for like HTTP2 compatibility, and I actually have written a translator like that. It hasn't been spruced up, but theoretically, anybody should be able to use that translator.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, do do I even need to implement it, or can I just import some library and do like translate routes and pass it on to my HTTP route implementation?
Right.
If someone wrote that, you can add my us to the us to the list for sure.
I mean, yeah, it basically does exist, but before like putting my stamp of approval on it and saying people should pull it into their controllers, I'd want to, just clean it up a bit first.
Is that, since the translator does exist, is that kind of a two-way translator where it not just takes it to HTTP route, but will actually take it back? And like if you're trying to populate status, for example, that will work on the way back?
Yeah, status is definitely a gap with the current translation approach. So not at the moment, though I do think it would be possible to make something like that happen.
Cool. So just catching up with notes. So status is gap and translator right now, but possible potentially. Okay. Hopefully I didn't miss anything else. But yeah, that is a thing that I just, again, lots of interest in gRPC route. I just want to make sure that we can move it forward, and to move it forward, we need people actually implementing it. Yeah. So it sounds like we have some coming, and I appreciate that. As a whole, this KubeCon was very memorable to me. I feel like this was a KubeCon that we clearly made it. This was very, very high interest. Shane and I had a talk on Thursday, and there were people, standing all the way around. It was overflowing. There were people sitting in the aisle of the, and in front of the screen, and just like we were way over capacity. And I just, I appreciate all the support, and it's, it's great to actually see so much interest in this. And yeah, I went to most of the Gateway API related talks, and all of them seem to have high levels of interest. Also should call out John and Keith, both here. They had a great talk on Gamma, and also lots of interest in that one. So yeah. Before and the last thing I'll say on KubeCon, CFP for KubeCon EU, it's always awful like this, but you just get out of a KubeCon and right away it's like, oh, I gotta figure out if I want to speak at the next KubeCon. But I would love to have Gateway well represented again. If you have ideas, I'd love to get some kind of centralized pool of ideas and then distribute speakers, or potential speakers, as well as we possibly can here. I'd say there's no real need to give a Gateway API talk on your own. There's lots of people interested in helping to present Gateway API. So let's, get as many people as we can through if we can. Yeah.
I'll probably resubmit the reference grant talk that I was going to give at this one to EU, which is by myself. Sorry, but I've got the talk written already.
Oh no, that's fine. That's fine. Completely fine. But I know there's lots of interest in making it to KubeCon. So maybe we can just have a pool of ideas. I have 3 or 4 different ideas that are Gateway related that I can share. I know I was talking to Shane, he has some. I feel like there's got to be something on Gamma. Again, I don't know what exactly we present there, but yeah, would love to be well represented again. Yeah. Okay, so that's everything for KubeCon. Before I move on, any questions, comments, concerns? I know others were there if they want to fill in any gaps I missed. Cool. All right, I'll keep on going then. I think, John, that means you're up next, conformance testing for mesh.
Hey, so I initially was going to just do this in the Gamma meeting, but I realized it probably overlaps quite a bit here. So I'll discuss it here, and if you want, you can tell me to go take it to the Gamma meeting. So there's kind of a broad set of issues, but the primary issue is that for mesh, the way we do conformance testing just simply doesn't work, right? Today we have the actual Go binary, and it makes an HTTP call to the gateway IP, which must be reachable. So this is oftentimes like an external load balancer, so it's no problem. That's fine for testing ingress, but for mesh, we need to test, connections between two pods that are running in the mesh. So we need a way to do that, basically. Obviously, in Istio, we have a way that we do this. I think it's decent if complicated. Others probably have ways to do this as well that we could look into. So kind of my request is that we, in this meeting, at least get some feedback on the types of things that we do or don't want to solve. We're not going to come up with a solution here, obviously. And if people have feedback on what they've done, what they like or don't like, and whatnot. More broadly than just like the where is the request coming from, there's also like we just use the Go HTTP client, which works fine for testing HTTP route. If we want to test a TCP route, like sure we can make a TCP connection, write some bits, but it's kind of painful API to use. And then what's the backend? Like, do we want to go write another backend, etc.? So that's kind of where the overlap with the non-mesh came in, is like, do we do kind of a more broad rehaul of what we're doing for conformance testing? So like in the Istio world, we kind of made our own Echo client and server. That's like the whole kitchen sink, right? It's got like UDP, TCP, HTTP, all the protocols, H123, whatever crazy thing that clients are doing. We can even send like invalid HTTP requests, for example, because we want to test like all these different things, right? And they're controlled through a gRPC endpoint, so we can tell like the client to send a request to someone else, so that we don't have to, so we can do the mesh testing. So like one option here is like we just lift that and use that. I'm probably biased. I don't know how others feel about that. If others have better solutions, happy to do that as well. We could build our own thing. So I just want to get some kind of high level feedback on that.
Keith, I'm not sure if you are around, but I'm curious. You mentioned also like you're doing something very similar. Is what OSM does something that you'd want to copy as well? Like,
honestly, what John described is fairly similar. It feels like there are more scenarios in the Echo server that Istio uses, so I'm fine doing that. Just whatever makes the most sense is going to be more extensible. Is what I'm cool with. But yeah, the solution is, I think there's general agreement about like how to do it broadly. There's not a lot of drift there. It's just a matter of, okay, what kind of features do we want to add to, what kind of traffic do you want to send, what interface do you want to provide for folks to extend and use it for conformance testing and things of that nature. So I wouldn't feel about using the Istio one, or we can do the OSM approach. It just does not matter to me.
Yeah, one thing I will say on using the exec specifically, I don't know how many tests we'll have, but at least at the Istio scale of testing, I don't think that would perform well. We're doing like 50,000 requests across all of our tests. Something to consider. We probably won't have that many here, unless we're in resounding success on our testing. But
yeah, it is slow. We're starting to see that as OSM scales as well. So that's a fair note for sure.
So this is kind of a higher level. I mean, this all sounds fine, and I'd love to get conformance in sooner than later for mesh. Just a higher level thing, everything we're saying here, and it's not unique to this, seems to basically rule out the idea of more than one mesh implementation being present in the same cluster. Is that something that we want to commit? Like, we're saying like there will only ever be a single mesh implementation in a cluster. I mean, that seems like 99.9% of cases, or maybe 100% of cases already, but just want to make sure.
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure why this discussion draw you to that conclusion either.
So, okay, so to clarify, with the conformance test we have for ingress, you specify I want to test this specific class, in this cluster. With this, I think you're just I'm assuming the way mesh conformance test would work is you would expect the mesh to be present in the cluster and then just expect a set of behavior to happen without specifying a mesh name or anything beyond that.
Yeah, I think since we don't currently in the spec declare like an enablement API, like we'll need for the testing to have some way to say like this mesh should be enabled for these tests. Like if everyone did namespace label, for example, like we could just say like, okay, what's the namespace label to apply, right? And it's almost like gateway class name. I don't know if that will work because not everyone's doing namespace label. But in some way, shape, or form, the user should declare that like the namespace is used in the conformance test or part of the mesh. But I don't know what that will look like exactly.
I think that the one thing that we did just talk about earlier on in Gamma, Robbie, is that even in the case where there's only one mesh running in the cluster, there may be times at which you end up with two of them running because you're doing an upgrade. And so
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. And so for Cilium, it's the same sort of thing. Like, there's only one Cilium because it's a CNI and it happens to be a mesh as well. So yeah, I think it feels like it's the edge cases there that are going to be the tricky bit. And I think that as John says, it's all about enablement. That was one where when we talked about it, we were like, this is a big can of worms. We're going to leave it for later. So yeah, I think that's where that is. We're like, enablement is hard. Everyone's doing it differently. Let's figure out how we want to represent the mesh stuff first, and then figure out the enablement story later.
Yeah,
That seems fair. Or go ahead, Keith.
I was going to say to the next point that this is something that I think we will definitely talk about in the Gamma meeting tomorrow. And tests are very useful, and as we all agree, and I think that this may potentially like make us go back to some of those things that we were punting and flesh that out, because conformance tests are kind of making those edge cases more, bringing those forward more than we would have considered previously. So this is a good discussion. I appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, no, this is great. I am fully supportive of getting mesh focused conformance tests in soon. Yeah, and it seems like this general approach is reasonable. So yeah, any last comments on this one?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it makes sense to use something already existing for the actual clienty thing. It seems like the Istio one has most of the stuff we're going to want anyway. That sounds fine to me. I think it's just a matter of, I don't think the tool matters as much as the fact that, we have to do something to be able to reach into the cluster and remote control things. And it would be nice if we can use something similar for outside the cluster for the sort of the ingress traffic testing. And it'd be nice if we could have like the same approach for everything. Even if you have to run like the client outside the cluster or something like that to make it work. Because right now the conformance tests do the actual requests themselves. Like if you're going to have a client thing and you're trying to do it the same between the ingress stuff and the mesh stuff, then you have to like have the conformance test start the client like outside the cluster so that then it can test the ingress path. But anyway, I think that's something we can talk more in the Gamma meeting about for sure. I think we got too much other stuff to spend too much more time talking about this.
Yeah, that is a really good point. In my head, I'd been just kind of assuming that these kind of, were independent of each other. There was your mesh conformance test and there were your ingress conformance tests, and they didn't overlap. But I realized that is likely naive. And figuring out how we bring those together is going to be fun. John, when you were starting on this, how did you imagine starting? Would this be like two separate things that eventually become one, or is it, I don't know. Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going I feel like they're probably not separate because like if we have to go implement this whole like in cluster thing, then we might as well just go to the end state and not try and do it like twice. So yeah, it seems like they're kind of disjoint things, but they should probably happen at the same time.
Okay, that's fair. All
Or at
right,
least
yeah,
the
well,
mesh part depends on the other part. Like if we want to do the non-mesh part first, then that's fine. But I think no one
Yeah.
really cares about this except for the mesh folks, since it's not blocking anything else.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to start out with them being disjoint, and then once we all get tired of having to think in 2 different ways to do tests, then someone will say, "Oh, let's make this all work the same way."
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I like you said, we do have other things to get to, but I am highly supportive of this, and just let me know how I can help. Whether it's 2 separate things that become one eventually, or it's easy, whatever it is. Yeah, maybe some kind of, we had a conformance gap initially. Maybe the next step for this is just to extend that conformance gap or create a new one, depending on your preference. That just, is basically a design of how this would work. Maybe that's the next best step.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Next up, I think we've got Candace. Sorry, I did not follow much last week, but I did notice there was a Slack conversation. Maybe, oh, that's not going to work well. But yeah, maybe you can provide some context, Candace. You're really quiet for me. I don't know if it's anyone else.
I'll speak up. Is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I started last week or maybe the week before trying to get some clarification of pass through, the spec for pass through, because we had, it finally sort of sank in that pass through is currently experimental now. It never made it to the V1 beta 1 milestone. So I had asked about it, and it turns out that there aren't enough implementations of it, and there aren't enough conformance tests for it. So I started looking, through our the documentation for pass through, and I had some questions about it myself. And now I'm wondering if there are few implementations of it, because it's not exactly as clearly specified as it could be. So I don't know if you want me to go into detail about.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So let's see. It's supported experimentally, so it's in the alpha directory. It's not in. It hasn't graduated to beta. In gateway types, we have pass through on the listener. So you can define pass through on the listener, and then also in the user documentation, there's a description of TLS route, which is not exactly aligned with, or it doesn't seem to be aligned with how we describe TLS as a function of the listener. To me, anyways, it doesn't seem like the 2 things go together properly. So I thought maybe it seems sort of like a mistake that there's or not a mistake, but I'm not sure why there is a TLS mode in the gateway listener. Does it belong there? Not sure. And Nick replied in the Slack thread itself, and sort of explained it a little bit better. So maybe you guys already know how this works and it doesn't seem unusual to you the way that it's documented, or, you know, kind of available in two different places that are not exactly contradictory, but not exactly in alignment with each other. So I wanted to bring that up as something that we could probably do a little bit better at explaining, in order to get more implementations and more conformance testing available so that we could eventually get this out of experimental and into a stable channel. Is that enough background?
Yeah, that's
You go first,
perfect.
Rob.
I was gonna hand off to you actually, Nick. You are about go for it.
So yeah, I 100% agree that what is there at the moment is very confusing. It's, you know, I think that it is basically, I think the nicest way I can say this is organic growth. Yeah, like we kind of went backwards and forwards on exactly how we were going to handle like terminate versus pass through a couple of times while we were making our way through, and this, you know, this is yeah, this basically is like an appendix. Like it's a vestigial organ that you know, is there, and it's going to be, you know, tricky to remove now. So I think the things that we can do to tidy it up are, as you say, I mean, it's possible for us to just remove the, like it's possible for us to just remove the TLS mode field. That is a large change because we would need to do like a deprecation cycle and some other stuff like that. But like, I think that everything we were trying to represent in that TLS mode field is better represented in like the choice of route that you're using, like the choice of route resource that you're using. It would be better to just say, hey, let's you know, if you're using a TLS route, that's pass through. If you're using a HTTP route, that's terminate. That's the story. Like that would be much simpler. I think there is sort of interplay with a couple of other features, like the protocol field is sort of intended to, it's actually ended up working like it's kind of a like route restrictor, where if you say like TLS for the protocol for that listener, then it kind of implies, hey, you need to be terminating HTTPS or using a HTTP route or using a TLS route to forward. But I think that yeah, that's the field I'm talking about. Yeah, I think the TLS mode type is like completely obsolete at this point. And it would be better to just be like the type of route that you attach sets the type of listener.
That seems a bit unclear to me. Like, what happens if I create a gateway and I have the TLS spec there, and it allows any route, right? Well,
Yeah.
First, at this point, do we have to have a certificate there or not? We need to validate this, right? So at this point, we can't reject it because it could be passed through. And then later they add an HTTP route. Now the gateway is invalid, actually, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, we report that in status fine. And now they add a TLS route. Now, does the TLS route win or does the HTTP route win? Like the HTTP route was there first, but the TLS route kind of makes it valid. And then the user goes and adds a certificate to it. Now what happens, right? Is it the HTTP route wins and the TLS route isn't valid? Like I get the motivation. It just seems hard in practice.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean,
I don't know if this is something we care about. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to forget. But you may also, I don't know if we have conformance around this, but like terminating the TLS connection and then having no routes might be different than not terminating the TLS connection. Like it may be valid to have a gateway with no routes. I'm not sure if that's true. And it's kind of unsettled, but
yeah, I think that's undefined at the moment. There's a few things like that we haven't defined yet. I see Travis has a good point in the chat that yeah. So I think this is kind of like a terminology thing as well, a naming thing. That, you know, for some people it seems clearer that you have a TLS route and then choose in the TLS route whether or not you terminate the traffic or not. But the reason that we've called the things like this is that the HTTP route inspects HTTP, right? So if it's terminated or not, doesn't like is not relevant for the fact that it inspects HTTP, right? The idea is HTTP route has the semantics available to do method routing and header routing and path routing and stuff like that. That's only valid if you can inspect the HTTP stream at the gateway. And so you have to terminate, you have to either have no TLS or you have to have terminated the TLS beforehand before you can inspect the HTTP stream. And so the idea here is that TLS route is specifically designed to not inspect the TLS stream aside from doing the SNI, the handshake enough to get the SNI and route it off to the place where it's going to end up. And I think that's, in my mind, that is the key thing, the key difference between the two things and why they're named the way they are. But like, it is very, very clear, because we've got lots of questions about this, that we have not done a good enough job of explaining that that's why we've named the things this way and that's what they're intended to do. And yeah, like the fact that Travis, I think the way you wrote it is 100% fair. It's just not the way we ended up designing the API. And so like, we need to sort of ease people into the fact that maybe this may not match up to their initial expectations. And we got to, get people across the, this is the conceptual gap. And I think the same is true for the TLS mode type. Like, there's a conceptual gap there of like, you can set the TLS mode on the listener, but what does it mean? Well, it depends on the route that you've got attached. And so like, that's like it's not a very clear place for the spec to be in. And yeah, like I said, this is organic growth, right? Like, we went backwards and forwards on this a lot. And that's why it's like that. It is not like that for any specific design reason.
Yeah, I would, good summary of current state and current issues. And I think organic growth is a really good term for the mess we found ourselves in here. Travis's comment in chat specifically reminds me of a PR that I think just got stale. I don't know if we ever came to a good conclusion on it, but I remember there was a community discussion of whether TLS route should support terminate as a TLS mode. I think that was the discussion I'm remembering. And yeah, I can see how that would be confusing of the, you want to use TLS as your routing mechanism, but you can still terminate on the gateway and then encrypt again between gateway and route. And yeah, anyway, I think we have a lot of work to do here. I'm not sure the best way to, I don't think we can remove the TLS mode field now. It is something that has made it in the API this far, but we definitely can do something to improve the documentation, and maybe getting some implementations of TLS route out there will help clarify, and certainly conformance tests will help clarify our desired behavior here. Out of curiosity, has anyone implemented TLS route so far?
The PR that is due to be merged sometime this week for Cilium's Gateway API support. I think, actually, no, I can't remember if it's TLS, just the termination or the route, but it's going to happen soon for TLS route for Cilium.
We have it in Istio.
Okay.
Traffic director has it as well.
Okay.
So, I think the biggest thing here is conformance tests. If it's not going to take much conformance test stuff for us to be able to, like, we've got 3 or 4 implementations already. It's if we have some folks write some conformance tests for TLS route, then like that's, in my mind, there's not much, then that starts locking in the behavior enough that we can be like, okay, this is ready for beta. And the conformance tests are where we can have vigorous discussions about exactly what the fields mean and why they should be that way, and if that's the right way to do it and all that sort of stuff, because then the conformance tests are going to lock in what those fields mean and how the different fields interoperate. So if you want to be the one who makes those calls, then write the conformance tests and we can argue on the PR.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, Shane had been talking, I'd been talking with Shane and some others at KubeCon about L4 routes, and specifically trying to get TCP and TLS routes through. I think those two are, high on the priority list for 070 of getting them to beta. So, and I know Shane has said that he wants to spend more time working to move those through, but I know we can always use more help. But those two routes specifically are high on my priority list of just, and I think others, of getting them to beta and standard channel. Yeah. Candace, I don't know, did any of that discussion help? Do you have any additional comments, thoughts, questions, ideas for how we can improve?
Do you consider this something important enough to try to promote in the next milestone? I think it's too late for for this milestone, right?
Yeah, it's too late for this milestone. I don't think we have as in-depth tracking as we want for the next milestone, 070. I know we discussed some of these ideas. No, you're right. Micaiah mentioned this as well. I had thought that I talked with Shane about TLS as well, but anyway, some of this had been discussed at KubeCon, but again, we don't have anything written down in any formal way about 070. This is more just theoretical ideas of what's next on the roadmap, but we need to get that into a milestone. But again, we actually need to get 060 out the door before we go too far towards 070.
Just registering my interest in this being some. We kind of need this. We need pass through. We need re-encrypt. I'm also sort of interested in whether pass through would have any changes to pass through or any clarifications would have any impact on re-encrypt. So in my mind, they're interrelated, but I don't think they are in most of the implementations.
Yeah, I think because of the way, because as I talked before about how generally we've kind of assumed that people want, the reason you want to terminate and then re-encrypt is that you want to be able to use HTTP stream properties to do routing, is that then most of the terminate re-encrypt use cases fall under HTTP route, because then you can use the HTTP properties for routing. In the case that you do want to terminate and re-encrypt a TLS stream, like, I think we've been like, well, yeah, why would you do that? Like, yeah, like, and I think that's been the sort of the, most of the time when people are terminating and re-encrypting, a lot of the time they want HTTP inspection rather than like just re-encrypt. So I think this is one where we need people to sort of write down like why you would do it that way and what you're trying to achieve. And that's like that's probably the matrix we want, is like, HTTP route, terminate, re-encrypt, HTTP route, terminate, HTTP route, don't just route based on the SNI, like just, like we almost need like a big list of use cases and then like how you do that in a table. So that then like, maybe that's cookbook style, maybe it's just a big table, I don't know. But like that feels like the sort of thing that we need to me is at least in a document so that we can all agree, even if it's not in this documentation yet, until we do all agree. But that feels like something that would sort of be well worth writing up. Like, and then once we get some use cases, my experience has been that people have other use cases that the first author hasn't thought of. And so this, writing out a table like this, and then having people like contribute your use cases, and we'll figure out how we represent them, even if it's not representable yet. Micaiah asks, is there any codified opinion on the behavior for HTTP route when the host header and SNI mismatch? That's domain fronting. And that is definitely a use case that we need to talk about, because sometimes you want to do that, but a lot of times, if we don't have client certificate auth yet, but if you have client certificate auth and you allow domain fronting, you have just given people a way to finish the SNI handshake and then route to some other HTTP service. So big security problem. Like this is the exact reason why you want to write down like use cases and be like, we want to have the SNI and the host name and the HTTP host header mismatch. And then you have a risks column or something like that. But this is exactly what I mean.
And just to respond to Micaiah's last question, in chat, specifically, we have strongly recommended that implementations ensure that S9 host header match to avoid domain fronting, but the only requirement is that if you don't verify that, you must clearly document that you don't. So there is, we left some room open for domain fronting. Yeah. So wow, we've got a lot. I can't keep up with everything in chat. Wow, I didn't even know we had this. Yeah, we've got this all over the place. Yeah, this is inconsistent.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and this is the problem, right? There's like 4 or 5 different places where this information is. It's been written at different times when we had different ideas or something like that. No one sort of sat down and been like, how do we talk about this all over the whole docs, in all of it?
Yeah.
And how do we write, and how do we nail it down? So like, I think that's probably like starting with the use cases and the, I think that table is a good place to start for some of the use cases and some of the things that we're talking about here. Yeah, but I think that like this is one of the times when one person needs to get all of it into their head, be like, here's all the problems. And then we can all start talking about like, what's the solutions? But one person needs to do the review and get it in their head, like, and write down a list of all the problems and all of the things, maybe 1 or 2 people. And then we will have a way forward. Like I did with the status thing, right? Like, I had to go and read like every status thing we did and figure out like, what were we doing and make some ideas up.
Yep. Anyone want to volunteer to be that person for TLS route and pass through?
I can try. We have a vested interest in it. So
thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you for all your help with this. I think we should move on, but yeah, thank you for bringing this up. This is a very confusing part. I didn't even realize how confusing. I have behavior that I expect in my head, and then sometimes I look at the docs and that doesn't always match up. So thank you.
okay, thanks.
So next up, the V060 milestone. We really need to get something out soon. Let's run through. I think a lot of these left are status. I don't know. Maybe Nick, do you have any status update?
I do not have status updates. I think it is a lot of this is, there's a couple of people have picked up some of the issues that were spun out of this. So I think there was a question in the channel by Lucas Kappa about fixing up accepted condition. I think I need to check in with him about which issue he's got and which issues are still outstanding. So yeah, it looks like Lucas is doing the add programmed ready condition and move ready to extended conformance part. I think that actually is not in the milestone, and it should be. Oh, it's in 070. Okay. I think that probably should be 060 because it's part of the status rewrite. I will fix that now.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I must admit, I needed to not be doing too much work last week while you were all having a good time and catching up and stuff, and I was sitting at home by myself. So I am a little bit behind. So I will go through the GEP 1364 and just check where things are at, and do a bit of an update today on that issue, and make sure that we've got all of the outstanding work covered in issues that are assigned to somebody. I think that should cover out most of the remaining things.
Great. No, thank you for all the work on this. It looks like we have somebody assigned to basically everything in the milestone now. I appreciate all that you've done to help make status better. in this release. The one thing that I want to call out, as nobody is working on this right now that I'm aware of, is the problem that John found in our conformance tests. This feels like just anybody can work on this. John, if I'm remembering correctly, the actual change we need to our conformance test is pretty minimal, right? It's just or is this real? No. I'm not sure. But anyway, I think this is a really small fix. And I know at least one of the things is changed, but we still need some more work. So if anyone has some time to spend on conformance tests, this would be very useful. And we do need to have it fixed before we try and release 060. Yeah, so if anyone has extra cycles, take a look at this one. This is 1473. All right, and I know we are quickly running out of time, so I want to keep on moving on this one. Let me just mention that Ingress to Gateway finally has some code, and actually, thank you, Sanjay. It looks like we have another PR. Yes, this is still rough around the edges, but one of those works on my cluster kind of thing. So it works good enough. We presented it at KubeCon last week, and yeah, thank you for the help on getting this one through. But I feel like a lot of the things in Gateway API have a pretty high bar to entry, and that it can feel overwhelming to start on any work. Ingress to Gateway is not intended to be that. It's meant, if you have any annotation you want to convert from Ingress to Gateway, jump on in. Want this to be something that anyone feels like they can contribute to. And I appreciate that Sanjay has taken the time to actually document the current behavior of how this works. So I think anyone can feel welcome to review any PRs here, create issues, etc. Just I look at this as just an extension of the Gateway API subproject. So definitely keep an eye on this, and if you want to contribute, very welcome. All right, next one up, just a question for the group here. This was actually Arco. I think you're on the call. So I think this all looks great, but I think this is the first time we've had a implementation on our implementations page include their conformance test status as, this implementation as of this release passes conformance tests as of this release of Gateway API, which I think is great. Do we have any, is this something we want to encourage more broadly until we have more centralized conformance reporting? Do we want to save this until we have centralized conformance reporting? Any preference, opinion here?
I think having something is better than nothing. And I think that I think having something is better than nothing. And the more people put stuff in here, the more we can figure out what information needs to be in there and what's useful and stuff, and that will help us write the standardized way to do it. So yes, I'm definitely in favor of more of us doing this.
Cool. I think that's good enough for me. I'll just LGTM this and it can go in. But just wanted to make sure. And again, since we're letting this in one way, I think if you have an implementation and you want to update the conformance status, better somewhere than nowhere.
Yeah, passing conformance, chat about it.
Yep. And at this point, we are just blindly trusting you. Please don't take too much advantage of that. But at some point, we will have centralized conformance reporting that come with some form of verification as well.
Yeah, there's a bunch of hoops we need to jump through to make it work the way, like the upstream one is, there is quite the, I don't want to call it a Rube Goldberg machine because it's quite like, that's not very complimentary. But there are a lot of pipes and wiring that fits together to make that thing happen.
Yeah, Yep, definitely. And then next up, I think we have a few minutes. Sunjay, I think you're on this call. Yes. Policy attachment.
Yeah, so doesn't have to be too in depth since we don't have that much time, but Contour we started experimenting with and implementing some more advanced features with policy attachment or filters or whatnot. There's some links to some spikes in Contour where that work. Not tested or anything, but just some things that work. Got a couple examples of things where policy attachment is kind of a little funny. So, I saw in the original GEP for policy attachment that there was the idea that it could be extended. The target ref in a policy could possibly be extended with a section name field. And I think my conclusion out of this little experiment that would be quite useful, because let's take the example of trying to trying to apply different policies to different listeners. Right now, you'll have to actually separate them out into different gateways. And depending on your implementation, that could mean that you actually end up getting a whole different control plane and data plane because you've got a second gateway resource. Being able to apply a policy to a subsection of a resource would be super helpful. And similarly for the kind of individual route case, if you want to apply to a policy to a particular route, you need to separate that out into its own resource. There's ways that you can work around these sort of organizational things, but they kind of force you as a user, as an organization, different personas to into a kind of a prescribed way of organizing all of your resources in your cluster, which I assume is not kind of what we want to do. We want to let people have as much flexibility as we can. So the spikes that I did is just implementing like rate limiting with Contour and Envoy with a policy, and also did it with a filter just to see how that would play out. So got some other notes on when you would use policies versus filters. I think there was a discussion in a previous meeting about kind of having like a decision tree about like when to use what type of extension point. So yeah, happy to talk with anyone about that. Start a discussion here so we can start discussing asynchronously, but yeah.
No, this is awesome. We've been needing more examples of policy attachment. I thank you for trying it out and finding the gaps in our approach right now. Right now, it's pretty theoretical. There was a KubeCon talk actually about policy attachment from Linker D. Matei, if you remember, he was at some of our earlier meetings, but yeah. He had written that talk, and so interesting stuff there. I actually was talking at the same time, so couldn't make it directly, but I've watched it since. It's highly recommend. I think this is, everything you've described. I haven't read this yet, but everything you've described makes sense as kind of the gaps right now. And the other thing that I'm unsure of right now is our kind of inheritance model is very complicated, and I don't know that that's been tested well enough, so I very much appreciate you trying this out and writing this up. I'll try and make a note to respond to this once I have more time to look through it. But yeah, we need more time spent on policy attachment to see if the model we've proposed actually does work well, and if not, what we can do to make it better. And it seems like at least a section name is a good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, we're using the section name in other places. It does make sense to allow tighter targeting, but it just means that we'll need to be specific about how the defaults and overrides work if you're sub-selecting by section name. Right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's hard to write down those rules, but we'll have to write down those rules.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and just generally, I mean, I've started thinking about like what would a conformance test with this or something for this even look like? I don't know. Right. That's also quite difficult to generically do, but
Yeah, I mean, I think that the problem with policy attachment is it's always going to be custom. Like by definition, the whole point of policy attachment, unless we create standard policies for something, I don't know what that, the only thing that I can think of that even comes close enough to being standard that we would want to do it as a standard policy is like maybe like the TLS version or something like that, something very simple like that, that would explain, that would show people how the inheritance and stuff works. But like most of the things that you're going to want to do with this, the reason that you use policy attachment is you can't make it standard enough to be able to just make it a resource. And so that's the policy attachment is like one of the escape valves that we have for, we can't all agree on how this works. And so everyone's going to need to do their own thing where everyone, you want to be the largest set of people possible, right? Like to go back to the classic timeout example, you would need an Envoy timeout policy and an Nginx timeout policy probably, or whatever other data path timeout policy, right? Like because the timeouts are so different between implementations. So if we wanted to have conformance testing for policy attachment, it would need to be something very simple that then becomes like a standard object that is attached via policy. That might be useful to then make clear to then give people a concrete example of how the defaults and overrides should work, and that would let us say, write conformance testing to say if you default with a section name, here's what happens, and if you override with a section name, here's what happens for a gateway or something like that, right? Like, and that's we can write down rules until we're blue in the face, but until you have a conformance test that sets out how those rules work, like it's only ever going to be like for policy attachment. So yeah, I think. Yeah, I really like the discussion, man. I really appreciate it. It's I'm really glad that someone's actually finally doing it. I've had in mind, I need to go and watch that talk, Rob, because I've had in mind a little bit of a rewrite of those docs for a while to sort of break out the difference between policy attachment as we currently describe it and the meta resource pattern that we've used a bit with like reference grant and other resources, where you have like a resource that wraps some other resource, like that invisibly wraps some other resource by targeting it. We've used that pattern with reference grant and some other, and like I think that's a useful pattern as well, but it's not the same as policy attachment. And people have called it policy attachment. I'm like, no, policy attachment, it's all about the defaults and overrides. But we don't have a name for the other thing. So so we need to give the other thing a name so that we can all talk about it in the same way. So that is definitely a thing that's on my to-do list.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think we are at time, so I don't want to keep anyone too much longer, but thank you for bringing this up. Lots more to come on policy attachment. I think Nick kind of alluded to the idea of like Envoy policies. There's some broader interest in that. Maybe that's topic for another meeting, but yeah, I would love to see what we can do here. There's a lot more in this list. I want to highlight if people have time on their own to run through this list of potential release blockers. There's some issues and PRs that need review. So if you can kind of follow up from this and run through some of these, that would be very, very helpful. But with that, we have gone over time. If you're interested in Gamma, we may see you tomorrow at the community meeting. Otherwise, have a great week and we'll talk to you next week.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.